I want to start off this morning with a question. Is it all right to ask a question this morning? Everybody ready for this question? It's gonna be a really personal question. Do some deep reflecting here. Have you ever made eye contact with a guilty party? You know what I mean? Like you have that moment across the room where it's like, I saw you. Maybe it's your kid. It's like, I saw you sneak that brownie that I told you couldn't have. You know what I'm talking about? Like that moment. Kurt's like, yeah. Kurt's like, I'm the one taking the brownie though. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and maybe that is true. Maybe you're the one that has had the awkward moment of like, oh, you saw me? Right? Like, I think we've all had those moments. And this morning, we're talking about guilt. We're talking about being the guilty party. And this morning, my hope is not that you feel guilty. My hope is that you experience some sort of healing from that guilt, that you maybe find some hope, you discover or embrace a different way to live. Now, if you've been around 1128 for any amount of time, you've heard about our two dogs. We've got Tucker and we've got Echo. Tucker is 12 years old. He's an old man dog. This is him right here. You can just see in his face, like, his disdain for this picture, right? Like, I'm like, Tucker, I need your picture for this message. It's very important. And he's like, okay, like, really? We're going to do this, right? Like, when he was younger, he was a great dog. Now he's 12 and he's an old man that's like kind of like he wants to make it known that he's still around. Anybody else have a dog or a cat or a fox or something maybe that's like, you know, like a turtle? Like you got that pet that like it's just like it's still there. It used to be the only child, and now instead of being the only child, you've got like a human 9-year-old brother, a 7-year-old human sister, and beyond those two, now you've got to deal with this 50-pound, 5-year-old poodle mix that's like always happy and is like always wanting to play, and you're just like, come on, I'm 12. Anybody have a pet like that? Yeah, I know I'm not the only one. Maybe you know somebody that's got a pet like that, and that's the better way to do life, by the way, to know somebody with a pet like that. But here's the deal, like sometimes Tucker, He expresses his displeasure at life and his current situation by doing things that he knows we will hate, right? Like, it started a few years ago. I remember vividly the night that Colleen and I were down in the basement, and we had just put in like some new flooring in the basement, and he woke up from his sleep, looked at us, and just decided to relieve himself right there on the floor. Just like eye contact, like, yeah, I'm doing this right now, right here. You know, like he did that. And that continued for a little while. And Colleen actually became convinced that he was diabetic. And she was like, he's diabetic. This is why he's peeing everywhere. And I was like, but he looks you in the eye and knows what he's doing. It's not like he's like struggling. Like, it's intentional, Colleen. He's not diabetic. He's alive and thriving, unfortunately. And like, we're so happy that he's moved beyond that to now pulling shoelaces out of shoes. So when we leave, he goes and he finds all the shoes that he can, and he pulls the shoelaces out. He doesn't chew up the shoe. He doesn't destroy the laces. He pulls them out. I don't know how he does it. He carries the shoe to a different part of the house. He'll hide it. Last night, Julia was like, hey, has anybody seen my slipper? And we're like, no, you had him on both your feet a little bit ago. She's like, I don't know where it went. And we looked for about, a day. And then eventually at like 10 p.m. last night, Colin's like, oh, I found the slipper. It was like under something in the closet in our bedroom. Tucker. It's got to be Tucker, right? You know, like you just know it's Tucker. Like this is what he does. Now, I had the unfortunate experience on Tuesday morning with Tucker where he's taken it to a new level. Like, if you thought peeing on the floor was bad, if you thought moving shoes and taking laces out was bad, like, this one was just, like, a step further in my book. I came home from a nice walk. It was like 6 a.m. I took the other dog, so he's probably jealous at home that he didn't go for a walk. But he's 12, he's not going to make it on the long walk. And so I come home, and I see a fresh morning number 2 right in front of our door. Just sitting there, still steaming. And I'm like, what is this? he's lucky to be alive today. I will say that. I don't know what it is, but like when these things happen, at first I was like, well, which dog was it? You ever do that? Maybe you got 2 kids and you're like, which one of you was it? With the dogs, I'm like, well, which one was it? And I just asked the question, hey, which one of you did this? And the poodle, he's just like, like he's on some sort of like game show. It's the time of his life and he's happy. This guy, he slowly turns his back and slinks away. Like he knows it. He's guilty. We have that moment of like, yeah, you did it. And I think that we've all probably had those moments of like, oh yeah, I've done that. We've all had those moments where it's like, you caught me. We all have those moments where we just like turn our back and slink away and hope nobody notices us or sees us. Or maybe they'll forget that we took a number 2 on the sidewalk right in front of the door, right? Like we've all had those kind of moments in life. And let's be honest, no matter how perfect you are, no matter how awesome you think you are, you have screwed up at some point in your life. You've been guilty of something, no doubt. No judgment either, but we're all in this together. Christian counselors, a lot of them would tell you there's 2 types of guilt. There's overt guilt, and then there's covert guilt. Overt guilt is when you've done something wrong. You feel guilty. Some of us here this morning, we're feeling that in this moment. We're feeling guilty this morning. Maybe something happened at home before you came out this morning and you're just like, man, I shouldn't have done that. I'm feeling pretty bad about that. Or maybe it was something a couple days ago where you're still just kind of living with it. That guilt is like on your conscience and you're feeling bad. But even when you deal with that feeling, that guilt, you also have to experience the shame that comes along with it. You know what I mean? Like you might have done something, you might be guilty for an action, and that's bad enough. But then like you pile on this amount of shame that comes with it, and that seems to linger and linger. And to be clear, shame and guilt are not the same thing. A lot of times we confuse the two. We think, oh, it's just shame and guilt. They're kind of interchangeable. It's the same thing, different words, but the same idea. No, shame grows out of guilt. Guilt is knowing that you did something wrong, and shame is asking the questions, what kind of person am I that I could do that? Anybody ever asked that question? The shame is asking the question, what if somebody else finds out? Shame and guilt are 2 different things. And I imagine that Adam and Eve, very early on in the book of Genesis, they understood that shame and guilt are 2 different things. If you read and look in Genesis chapter 2, you understand at the end of that chapter that they were naked. They were naked, it was all out there, and they felt no shame. That's the last line in Genesis chapter 2. They weren't bothered by it, they were just cool. They were living life. They were loved, they were accepted, they were clothed in the approval of God. It did not matter that they were naked because God loved them for who they are. He approved of them. A few verses later, though, chapter 3, we understand that they're tempted. They give into this temptation. They eat from the tree that God had said, don't eat from the tree. And then immediately they're like, oh, shoot, like we're naked. We are unclothed right now. And immediately, like that moment of guilt, the shame starts to pile on. The shame of like, what if God finds out? Or who are we? What kind of people are we that we could disobey God? Are we bad people? They realize that they no longer have the approval of God because they disobeyed God. They did the one thing that God had told them not to do. And in this moment of realizing all that, the shame piling on, their nakedness became like evident, and it was like, shame, just shame. And they weren't clothed in that approval any longer, and they had to find leaves to cover it and to try and make it right. They felt shame, a deep sense of shame. They had that moment of guilt, that moment of like, I did something wrong. And then shame piled on. Guilt is knowing that you did something wrong, right? Shame is what you feel when someone else finds out. Guilt is easy to move past. Shame, not so much. Guilt is easy to move past because you can apologize, you can ask for forgiveness, you can make amends, you can take them out to coffee, you can make them a nice breakfast, you can pay the penalty, you can do whatever it takes to try and make it right. That moment can be made right. You can move beyond that moment of guilt and the mistake you made, but the shame tends to linger. It sticks. And you're always wondering about those glances and those stares from across the room, those side eyes when a person looks at you, and you feel that. Some of you are still feeling that mistake that you made in 2005 when you walk into a room and somebody's like, oh, that's them. Colleen and I are going to a 20-year high school reunion later this year, and I made a lot of mistakes in high school, and I imagine there'll be a lot of side eyes and glances like, oh, he's a pastor now? Okay. We'll find out. A few years ago, Forbes, they put out a list of 6 ways that you may be suffering from guilt and maybe don't even know. This might cut a little deep, all right? So like you might be suffering from guilt this morning and you don't know it yet. Number 1 is your close relationships don't last. You have such a deep wound, you have such deep hurt that people can't get close to you. 2, chronically tired or distracted is like just your way of living. You carry around some sort of burden, some sort of guilt, and it just causes you to feel tired, distracted, not present. Number 3, you joke harshly at others' expenses. And you think that, okay, if I could tear them down, like I'm going to feel better about myself. Number 4, you respond dramatically to other people's criticism of you. And anybody here starting to feel like, okay, maybe this is me. Maybe I've got a little bit of guilt. Number 5, maybe you're paranoid about what everyone's thinking about you. You project the bad things that you think about yourself onto them. Number 6, you sabotage your own efforts. You sabotage your efforts at work. You sabotage your efforts in relationships. You feel like, I just don't deserve to succeed. My marriage does not deserve to be good and healthy. My friendships, they're just always all going to be broken and messed up. You don't deserve it. Anyone feeling guilty this morning? Anyone ready to slink away? Anyone wish they weren't here? This morning is not about you feeling guilty. I said that at the top, and I really do mean it. This morning is about discovering hope, receiving help, and embracing a different way of living. And here's the good news. What guilt tears apart, what guilt destroys, the gospel rebuilds even better. The gospel rebuilds even better. And so to pick up where we left off last week in the book of Hebrews, we're jumping into chapter 9. And if you didn't catch last week's message, it was an online-only message. Go to our website, 1128community.org/on-demand, and you can find a message there from Nikki, who's part of our teaching team, and you can check that out. It was a great message, and it's about 15 minutes because it's online only. But the first 12 verses in Hebrews chapter 9 are really just a very detailed description of the temple. Right? Like it's a detailed description of how the temple was set up and its purpose in dealing with our guilt, and it's this purpose of dealing with our sense of separation from God. So the first thing that we learn about the temple is that there's a lampstand. A lampstand. I'm imagining, like some sort of lampstand that's elegant and really, really nice, and it's lit day and night. It never goes out. What this represents is God's presence, his continual presence with them in that space. It's a weird design. The Mishnah says it was supposed to look like the tree of life. It's kind of a weird lampstand that was always lit day and night, representing the presence of God always with them. Next in the temple was the table of the showbread. There were 12 loaves of bread on this table of showbread, and the bread, it's called the bread of presence. Now, it's interesting to me that most religions, they leave bread for their God. This bread, it symbolized the bread that God provided to them. The bread of the presence. The bread that God will always provide. The reminder that God did provide, God will provide, and God will continue to provide for them. Finally, in this first room was the altar of incense. The altar of incense, it stood right in front of the Holy of Holies, and it represented two things. The first is that it was just like this barrier between them and God. It was like one more barrier separating us from God. But the second thing is that their prayers were always going up before them, like incense going up. This is what the incense represented. And after you get there, you can enter into like the Holy of Holies in the innermost section, but there's like a curtain that separates that inner section from that first room. And now I like my blackout curtains. I cannot sleep if it's not pitch black in the room, and so we've got some pretty thick curtains in our room, and I love it, and it's great. It could be the middle of the day, and it's like nearly pitch black, and I could sleep like a baby. This is not a blackout curtain. It literally means, this name curtain, or the paraket, it literally means shut off. This type of curtain, it shuts everything off. And that's what the purpose of it was, to shut off. It was 4 inches thick. Could you imagine how heavy this curtain would be at 4 inches thick? It was made of 72 cords with 24 strands each, and I don't even know how to comprehend that. 72 cords with 24 strands each. It was blue, red, and purple, and it had multiple layers of interlapping and overlapping material. And it meant that the presence of God, which was just beyond this curtain, was in absolute darkness. And we were separated from it. You cross that curtain, you go through that curtain, and you're there. You're in the Holy of Holies, and there's one piece of furniture, which, according to Steven Spielberg, was found in 1936 by Indiana Jones, who was a globe-trotting archaeologist vying with Nazi German forces to recover the long-lost Ark of the Covenant, which is said to make an army invincible. If you didn't know, Indiana Jones, while finding this, had teamed up with a former romantic interest, Marion Ravenwood, and they raced to stop the rival archaeologist from guiding the Nazis to the Ark and its power. And if you're lost right now, if you're confused, if you're unsure what this is a picture of, have a conversation with your parents this afternoon, please. Just educate yourself. But inside the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. And there's a few things about the Ark of the Covenant. It was there, and on top of it was the mercy seat. On the mercy seat, you would sprinkle the blood of a clean animal. On top of the mercy seat were 2 cherubim, which were like the highest angels. They were guarding the entrance to the presence of God. And once per year, the high priest, would enter this place, enter the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and they would go and they would sprinkle blood of a clean animal sacrifice right there on top of the ark. Hebrews 9 reminds readers of the first covenant, the Levitical covenant, referencing that you cannot be defiled when you enter into this space. You must be clean. Any defiled person touching the ark was struck down and destroyed. And if you read the Old Testament, it actually happened. People who came into this space, into God's presence, and had not been cleaned, they were destroyed. Look up Nadal, Abide, Uzziah, and Uzzah. I've heard it before that when the high priest would enter into the Holy of Holies, they'd tie a rope to his ankle. And that if he went in and was in the presence of God and had not cleaned appropriately, he'd be destroyed. And eventually they would say, well, pull the rope. I don't know if that's true or not. But this is how serious this stuff is. The rituals were not to be taken lightly. They were there for a reason. But after all that, the author of Hebrews concludes this in verses 9 and 10. This is an illustration pointing to the present time. For the gifts and sacrifices that the priests offer are not able to cleanse the consciences of the people who bring them. For that old system deals only with food and drink and various cleansing ceremonies, physical regulations that were in effect only until a better system could be established. Basically, what we're reading is that this was temporary. These are just rituals, ceremonies, regulations, and that these things, they cannot do the one thing that we need to have done. They cannot remove guilt, and they cannot transform our heart. There must be something better. There's got to be something better. And we know that, right? Like the author has been working at this since chapter 1, wanting us to know, like, there is something better. Jesus is better. And now he's starting to get personal, right? Like if this was a persuasive letter, he's like, all right, like I'm taking it from like the theoretical to the personal, because I want you to understand how this impacts you and your family and your loved ones and your friends. Your guilt is not removed because of a once-a-year high priest visit into the Holy of Holies. Your heart is not changed because a high priest goes into that space once a year and sprinkles blood of a clean animal on that mercy seat. You're still guilty, and your heart is still deceived. These rituals, these ceremonies, these regulations, these laws, they don't do the thing that we need them to do. And so Christ has now become the high priest, it says in verse 11, over all the good things that have come. He has entered the greater, more perfect tabernacle in heaven, which was not made by human hands and is not part of the created world, with his own blood, not the blood of goats and calves, not the blood of an animal sprinkled over this mercy seat. He entered the most holy place once for all time and secured our redemption forever. Under the old system, the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer could cleanse people's bodies from ceremonial impurity. But just think how much more the blood of Christ will purify our consciences from sinful deeds so that we can worship the living God. For by the power of the eternal Spirit, Christ offered himself to God as a perfect sacrifice for our sins. That is why he is the one who mediates a new covenant between God and people, so that all who are called can receive the eternal inheritance God has promised them. For Christ died to set them free from the penalty of the sins they had committed under that first covenant. I love that clarity right there at the end. Christ died to set them free from the penalty. He died to set them free. Free from the sin that they've been chained to. Free from the sin and the guilt that they've been carrying around. Free from the burden that they know too well. Now, many ask the question, like, how does this work? Like, how are we actually freed of this sin? How does Jesus and how does his death actually remove my guilt? How does a man dying pay the penalty, not just for me, but for all who believe? And the answer is actually rather simple. But at the same time, we often feel like the answer is just not enough, right? Like Jesus, the Son of God, he died on a cross and he was buried. And then 3 days later, he rose again and he removes all our guilt. That's the answer. And we know that's the answer because God tells us that's what it does. God tells us that Jesus is the answer. And it sounds so simple, yet it's so hard to really trust and believe that that's the truth. There's got to be something more. But there's not. God tells us that. Verse 22, in fact, according to the law of Moses, nearly everything was purified with blood, for without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. That is why the tabernacle and everything in it, which were copies of things in heaven, like these were the exact replicas, if you will, of the things in heaven, they had to be purified by the blood of animals. But the real things in heaven had to be purified with far better sacrifices than the blood of animals. For Christ did not enter into a holy place made with human hands, which was only a copy of the one true heaven. He entered into heaven itself to appear now before God on our behalf. 25, and he did not enter heaven to offer himself again and again. He's not going to do this on repeat, because ever since that time, he did it once and for all. And he has appeared at the end of the age to remove sin by his own death as a sacrifice. And in verse 28, so also Christ was offered once and for all as a sacrifice to take away the sins of many people. How do we know that this is true? How do we know that this is what removes our guilt? It's because God tells us in his word. God tells us, trust this, believe this, put your faith in this. That Christ offered once and for all a freedom from sin and guilt. Christ offered himself as a sacrifice. He offered to take away, to take on the sins of many, the sins of those who would trust and believe. Faith is believing that to be true, even though it doesn't fully make sense, even though our minds cannot comprehend what that actually looks like. Faith is allowing that truth to transform and change our hearts. It's allowing that truth to transform how we live and affect how we love, because that's how we were loved first. Faith is trusting that your eternity, as well as here today, can be different because of the blood of Jesus. And that's the good news today. The good news of the gospel is that what guilt destroys, the gospel rebuilds even better. As we wrap up this morning and as the band joins me on the stage, I don't know what guilt has destroyed in your life. If I had to guess, I would imagine it's relationships. I think relationships are probably the thing that suffer most because of our guilt. Maybe it's your relationship with yourself, that confidence that you're worthy, the confidence that you do have something to offer. I'm sure you have moments of deep regret, followed by those moments of wondering, what if? What if I wasn't guilty? What if I had not made that mistake? What if I'd done it different? What would my life look like instead? How would things have changed? How would things be today? What friends would I have? What friends would I no longer have? What friends could I have made? Guilt, it eats away at us. It destroys us internally, tearing apart and eating away at our ability to love. Eating away at our ability to receive love. It tears apart our confidence. It makes us uncomfortable, and it tells us that we're not worthy. But the gospel says different. Jesus says different. God the Father says different. Jesus wants to rebuild you today. Jesus says you are worthy, and that's why I made the sacrifice. Jesus wants you to know that there is hope and there is healing for you. Jesus wants you to be freed from sin and guilt and the burden. Jesus has a different way for you to live today. And it's simple. You have to trust and believe that Jesus, one time, and that was enough, was the sacrifice for me, for you, for your neighbor. What guilt destroys, the gospel rebuilds even better. And we've got to trust that. We've got to trust that for our eternity. We've got to trust that for the here and now. Because if Jesus can save us for an eternity, he can definitely remove the guilt that we're feeling this morning and restore us to live a better life now. This morning, it's about living free in the moment. It's about not waiting for heaven, right? Like heaven will come, but you can live free of guilt today. This morning is about being alive. It's experiencing the life that God has for you. It's about doing life different, which we love to say around here. Guilt has destroyed something in each of our lives. You know it. I know it. We've experienced that and we feel that. But today, you have a choice. You have a choice to choose the sacrifice, to trust that that was enough, that one and only time forgives you and removes the guilt from you. You have a choice to believe that today might be the day that God begins rebuilding you into something even better. Let me pray for us now, that God would give us the boldness and the confidence to choose that. God, there's a lot of us in this room this morning that have experienced guilt. We've done things we regret, said things that we want to take back, have dark secrets that maybe we've just hidden and no one knows. You know them, God. And you want something better for us. So much so that you offered your son, Jesus, as a sacrifice, as the sacrifice, because you see us as worthy, you see us as lovable, and you want to call us yours. God, would we be bold this morning? Would we acknowledge our guilt? Would we confess it to you now? And would we receive the forgiveness that you offer us? Would we trust that you do forgive? Would we believe that you make us new? Would we have faith to be changed, the guilt removed and our hearts transformed so that we can live and love the way that we're supposed to live and love? God, help us to do that today. Help us to live that way each and every day. We thank you for the love of a good, good Father. We pray this in your name. Amen.